All right, Chris. So, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Ministry of Propaganda.
Welcome back.
Today we're going to be talking about kind of just a general geopolitics. There's been a lot of meetings and dams being blown up, African peace plan, Blinken also visiting Beijing, and all sorts of things like that. So we're going to cover a couple of these, cover the ones that sort of stand out to us and interest us. So, Chris, where do you want to start?
Yeah, so what's been, obviously a lot has gone on and that's all been very interesting, but what's been more interesting for me is the way the media's covered it. So just to jump into the big one straight away. So we'll just want to mention the dam. Obviously, a dam in Ukraine was attacked and has burst its banks, causing flooding of the village next to it. The village that it's flooded was in Russian-occupied territory, which I suppose is important. It happened just on the eve of Ukraine's counteroffensive that built up for weeks, and it was just about. So obviously that looks like it threw a fork in the works of that. Both sides have said that each other did it. Arguments can be made why it is beneficial for both sides to blame each other, but that's not really what I want to look at. I just want to point out how the media has portrayed it. So I've got here a article from The Sun.
Sun, okay.
So how Putin has become little Stalin using brutal Soviet tactics and blowing up a dam, sending his own men to the slaughter. Russia's brutal destruction of Ukrainian dam leads thousands fleeing their lives. So that's what they're drawing here, how this is a Stalinist tactic.
Oh my God.
And it seems like a very odd thing to even accuse of. Now, when I searched for this article, I read it a few weeks ago, and the only thing that stuck in my head was Stalin's playbook. So I banged that into Google. You can't believe the amount of times that phrase has been used by Western media since last year. It seems like everything Putin does now is out of Stalin's playbook. So just to drive that point home a little bit more, I've got here some exclusive footage of the dam bursting.
Okay, this is the footage. Oh yes, yeah. Yes. I knew this was coming. There it is.
There it is. That's your Stalinist tactic. Now, just to drive that home, but point home a little bit more. So that attack that the dam busters so heroically were pictured doing in that film, Operation Chastity? What's that word?
Chastise. Yeah.
So let's look at the casualties here. Factories and mines were damaged, and estimated 1,600 civilians, including about 600 Germans and 1,000 enslaved laborers, mainly Soviets, were killed during the flooding. That's the cost of that heroic footage that we just watched in that British propaganda film. Classic piece of British wartime film.
Yes.
So my question is, why is it Stalinist terror when the Russians do it, but British heroism when anyone else does it? Well, when the British do it. This is the complete. This is the sort of crux of what we've sort of seen in the media today. It's gaslighting at its pure sort of element, isn't it? Really.
Yeah, I think you get full points for that one, Chris, on exposing the absolute hypocrisy and contradiction between coverage. So yeah, the dam busters is something that I'm sure the Sun. I mean, we could Google it right now while we're recording, but I'm sure there's probably many articles from the Sun about the heroism and brilliance and the daring dash of the dam busters blowing up the dam, which, as you already pointed out, killed and destroyed factories and whatever. I like your observation. Excellent observation. And you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, it is completely hypocritical. I mean, this is the question of whether the Russians actually did it is still as we've already learned in this war, when something gets blown up, a piece of infrastructure, we have to have lots of investigations for months and months and months. So, just like the pipes, I guess we'll never know. It'll just have to be under investigation as to who did it. But actually, no, I'm wrong, because we've already been told it was the Russians, definitely the Russians. The Russians did this because, even though that dam is still overflowing with water, certainty has been determined with no investigation, whereas the pipe has been investigated 3 or 4 times and we're still not sure. So again with the way in which certainty is determined by motive, in this case, but certainty by motive is of course not enough when it came to the pipeline. So
it's like the saying, truth is the first casualty of war. And in a lot of, you can't really expect your enemy to tell the truth in a wartime strategy. Deceit isn't necessarily a bad thing. Preserving secrets is to be expected from both sides.
I did like the little Stalin. That's just good old Sun style of journalism. Stalin.
I can imagine that's the bit that really stings, to be honest. Just being called Stalin is one of it, being called Little Stalin.
Exactly. So that's the. Well, actually, I just brought it up just because we're talking about it. But there is an article here from the Sun, Inside the Incredible Life of the Last Dam Buster, George Johnson, Hero Johnny, literally hero. Here we go. I'll bring it up. We can't even. Oh man, I love this. Here we go. One moment. This is the same people, and here's our friend. Can you see that there?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. So there we go. There he is, the pilot who.
I'm fine, man.
There he is, inside of the life of last dam busters who escaped brutal dad. Sorry, to become World War II hero with odd best friend. Johnny prepared to press the button, lying on his stomach. There you go. This is the same thing that you've just said. But this is the Sun, the same people who just lamented old Putin for that same act. There you go. So no irony there for them.
No, not at all. And the fact that, to be honest, I wasn't particularly aware. I remember seeing the film probably back in the 90s on Channel 4. Didn't know much about the back history other than they designed a bouncing bomb. But in terms of, I was quite shocked to research for looking at the figures of death, because there doesn't seem to be very much mention that it might have slowed some Germans down. But the fact that it hit a prison camp and that the overwhelming majority of deaths were Russian dead, who, as far as the Western media count now, aren't people and don't matter. Even historically, I saw the other day Ukrainians were being praised for vandalizing a World War II memorial because it was a Russian memorial. These are your dead.
Yes. No.
When have we got to the stage now that it's okay to vandalize war memorials just because we don't? Because of current politics. I mean, surely that's not on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a on Twitter that I'm not going to share it now because it's buried in some messages, but there is footage of bulldozers knocking over Soviet war memorials in Ukraine and elsewhere. But they've got the names of soldiers, the names of troops that deployed to fight the Nazis, and also these people will tweet with a Ukrainian flag and a British flag next to it. And I don't know, they must have failed their MI6 propaganda training, because to tear down a war memorial for British people, I just don't think that's something that most British people, if they knew it was going on, would not have a good opinion of that at all.
No, and especially with British history, the majority of the Brits, they're usually a bit more clued up in World War II history than, say, the Americans were, who generally believe that they were the ones who took Berlin. To the point where it's portrayed in their films as that happening, where it was the Russians were the first ones there. I think I might be giving the British education a bit more credit than it deserves, but the majority of Brits who are into World War II history will acknowledge that the Russians did the overwhelming majority of the fighting. I know it's a big thing in Germany at the moment where they're talking about closing or just dismantling the big World War II memorial there.
In Berlin?
Yeah.
Really?
That's been a big point of contention. I think that's something that does get threatened and then removed from the table quite often, but I think the threats looking quite serious at the moment.
That would be a very big upset. Yeah, that would be
surprising.
Yeah.
And it's a weird thing to do for the sake of attacking a current political crisis.
Yeah, I mean, so there is actually a statistic, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but even amongst British people, there was a question. I think the question was who helped more, or whose contribution was, defining in the Second World War. And if you asked people that in 1945, they would have said the Soviet Union. Majority would have said the Soviet Union. And there's a graph which shows you the majority back then, the closest time to the war, and they would have said the Soviet Union was the biggest support, and the US support, saying the US were the defining contribution, was very small. And as time goes on, the graph literally switches to where you get to today, where people somehow have reached the conclusion that it was the Americans that were the defining contribution to defeating the Nazis, which is inaccurate. But I think the point there is that people are subject to propaganda, are subject to
historical revisionism.
Historical revisionism, exactly. So I'm going to show you this. And so what I want to get in is this thing about Beijing, right? So we've had Blinken finally visiting Beijing, and we've seen another iteration of the famous filters that get applied to any footage from the BBC or from Washington Post and others, which depicts China, other countries too. They used to do this with the Soviet Union, but Mexico also has a special filter. Iraq gets a filter. Yeah. We've seen the famous Beijing filter. So here you go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Here we go. So there you go. You've got your. I mean, I think they've got the Chinese there, so it's like Beijing de Tianna, which means Beijing.
So they've added a layer of digital smog over it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just, and so no wonder people's opinions of stuff gets changed and warped.
And this is literally a problem that is 20 years out of date, isn't it? Like a lot of people now still have this connotation of, they think, if you see pictures of Shanghai, it's just layered in smog. I'm like, yeah, if you look at them, like from turn of the millennium, it's like that's not been the case for a very long time.
Yeah.
But the idea of them literally digitally editing the photos, we've just seen it. They do it, and
yes, it's there. No, it's clear. I mean, it was a blue sky day, and there's apparently just the BBC camera has some sort of gray tone for it for no reason.
Yeah, I suppose if you were to ask them why, they'd probably come up with a very mundane sort of editing reason. Like, have you ever heard when they talk about footage of Mars, where they say that they tint Mars red to match people's expectations of it, so they know what they're looking at straight away? And the same thing they do in film with Mexico, where they make it yellow, so that we're now looking at Mexico and it's yellow for some reason.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, where did that perception come from?
We expect it to be smoggy, so they've just added smog. It's like, it's the sort of chicken and the egg thing. We expect it to be smoggy because you keep showing us it like that.
Correct. Right. So so where did that perception come from? From you. You made that. Yeah. Okay. But that was the minor point. So I mean, I don't really have much to say about Blinken's actual visit. I mean, it is the first visit by a sort of important U.S. diplomat since 2018. By U.S. Secretary of State 2018. So that's a long time. I mean, COVID obviously is the main reason. And then remember, Blinken was supposed to be there in November, but then the infamous spy balloon, forced him to not go. So the only people visiting China have been Nancy Pelosi and Messi, apparently. So a different story. But I don't really have much else to say. I think that the people, the only thing you could say about this is that the GOP, the Republicans, were kind of enraged about the fact that he had gone, So there is something to say about that. That you have, the Republicans are probably more of the China war party, and the Democrats are more of the Russia war party.
Yeah.
This is what the guys at the Duran would say, at least, as well. But I think we've said the same thing too. That's there's just two arms of which one to go to war with first. Not a question of should we be going to war with anyone, just who first, who is more important to blow up. And
we've made this point a few times of this crisis in Ukraine at the moment is very much the sort of introduction to the greater American-China war. This is the warm-up act.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to go on to talk about the Ukraine sort of situation, because we've had African leaders going there. You also had this document that Putin pulled out. So, yeah, do you want to talk about that or not? Start yet?
Yeah. So obviously we've got at the moment. What countries are there? We know that they're currently visiting Kiev and then go into Moscow afterwards.
Oh no, they've already been to both. So they were in Kiev 5 days ago, and then they were in Moscow on the weekend.
So the event that's coming up, though, if it still is happening, is Putin going to South Africa.
Oh yes, for the BRICS summit. So
yeah,
I think he is. I don't think
because that's now up in the air, isn't it? He doesn't.
Right.
I think he doesn't need to go, but obviously that's going to be difficult in itself because South Africa is a signatory of the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
So their responsibilities for that is that they should be arresting Putin. They're clearly not going to.
Right.
It just shows a lot of these divisions. But I thought that was interesting because that was planned first, and then this event of them going to Kiev was sort of afterwards. And it seems like this has been arranged to sort of explain away that.
You mean
as a way of sort of not that to show that Africa isn't sort of and different African leaders aren't playing favourites between one and the other, that they're trying to be as
So I
neutral as
think
possible.
That's it. I mean, they're doing a similar thing to the Chinese position. Obviously, the Chinese didn't go to Kiev, but they haven't closed their doors to the Ukrainians either. You're absolutely right. I mean, it is they went to Kiev first. They've spoken to both parties, and I think Putin has also said that everyone appreciates that they are trying to be neutral or diplomatic at least. But their 10-point plan is quite reasonable. It sort of gives space to both sides to meet. So I'll read the points here. So African 10-point peace plan. So both leaders must listen to one another. The war must be settled through negotiations and diplomatic means. There must be a de-escalation of conflict on both sides. The sovereignty of countries in terms of the UN Charter and internationally recognized principles should be recognized. There needs to be guarantee of security for all the countries involved. This issue has been raised by all sides. The movement of grain across the Black Sea must be opened up to remove blockages so that commodities can reach markets. Humanitarian efforts must be set up for those affected by the war. Prisoners of war must be released and children returned to Ukraine. There must be reconstruction of the destruction caused by the war, and further engagements should be held to encourage more dialogue through the Africa Peace Mission. So nothing, I think, too difficult to stomach from both sides. That you can see that it's a nicely packaged way of trying to get them to come together. I mean, the first point is quite easy. Leaders must listen to one another. But I guess the facts on the ground right now are probably what, they're just not going to make that happen. I mean, the Ukrainians have got their 12 minus whatever casualties of brigade paid for by NATO that are busy fighting right now. So, they can't really...
it sounds pretty cookie cutter. And as you were actually reading that, I've just generated my own in the same amount of time. So I've just asked ChatGPT, write me a 10-point peace plan for Ukraine and Russia. And it's pretty much the same, to be honest.
Okay, that's interesting.
Ceasefire and withdrawal, diplomatical negotiations, territorial integrity is like how to write a peace plan without upsetting anyone.
Yes, yes, yeah. Right.
So it does seem to be that come to Kiev, make sure you bring a peace plan with you.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing that Putin, there's two things actually I think that Putin had to say to this. One is that he raised the fact that, well, if you were to follow the UN Charter, that the independence of the DPR and LPR would have had to have been recognized then. I'm not exactly sure on the legal side of that, what he's referring to, but he straight away kind of said that, well, okay, if you want to respect the UN Charter, then Donetsk and Luhansk would have been recognized. Yeah, but this one also actually brings us to something that we've probably discussed probably more than a year ago, but which people have forgotten, which we kind of were reminded of about 2 weeks ago, is Serbia and Kosovo. So
Yes.
you had this spike of conflict and violence in Kosovo from a bunch of Serbs who live in northern Kosovo.
Yeah.
So basically making Kosovo's Kosovo. And the Serbians don't recognize Kosovo. The Russians support the Serbians because it's their territorial integrity. But the West says Kosovo is independent. Kosovo is a country, violating their own argument. So
the fact that they've had an election in Kosovo where it was a ridiculously small amount of voter turnout. I think it was literally less than 10, I'm pretty sure, wasn't it?
Oh, it was tiny. It was tiny. I mean, they boycotted. So, yeah.
And
it was,
back of that, they've implemented ethnic Albanians into municipalities in a pro-Serbian majority population. So this is clearly the fact that even the UN turned around and said this was a stupid idea.
Everyone, I think even the Americans were like, this was not a good idea to impose, a minority mayors and stuff on a that don't represent the people. And that didn't have a mandate. The mandate was not a mandate. No majority at all. But so just going back to it. So this is where, it's all well and good saying, the UN Charter, but okay, well, there's a lot of stuff there that you could, as Putin says, well, the DPR, the LPR, they are a group of people who disagreed with the coup and disagreed with the Maidan and are ethnically Russian and speak Russian and didn't like the idea of being told not to speak their language and various other things that, have led us to where we are now. I still commend the effort to try and, bring negotiation. One of the big points for the African leaders is that it's about the grain. It's about food. The increase in cost of food, as they would say, as a result of the war, is one of the reasons they've turned up there.
Yeah,
another little interesting bit
of the reason why so many people do get involved in this crisis that where they wouldn't have done in the others is because Ukraine, as it was always called in the Soviet Union, it's a breadbasket.
Yes,
it is. So much of the world's grain does come from there. I mean, the whole reason why their current flag is the colours it is because of grain fields.
Yeah, the yellow is the grain, right? Yeah. Not the only other thing, but this whole thing with the African Peace Mission, actually, there was sort of, in addition to this 10-point plan, but before they got there, the Polish basically stopped the South African delegation from going forward. So I believe they had to take a train. They landed in Poland and they took a train into Kiev. And the Polish stopped the South African delegation from going. They said the security detail can't go because they're carrying weapons and they haven't got a permit and blah, 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 and came up with some excuse. And it did not go down well. There was a lot of anger from the African leaders and from wider afield. Allegations of racism, allegations of all sorts of stuff. But I mean, I don't know. I don't think you have to be a genius to see that the Polish were just basically causing shit. They didn't want. They don't want a peace program. The Polish right now are in a sort of very nationalistic mood and happy, basically biting at the bit to they would love to get involved. I think the leaders would at least.
There seems to be some sort of revenge mentality going on in Polish leadership at the moment. Not just them, Lithuanians as well, I've noticed.
Yeah.
And Estonia and Latvia. It does seem to be that, like, because they're on the Russian sort of front line, as the Western media seems to be calling it now, the new Iron Curtain, which is their curtain. Yeah. They're the ones, them in Finland are the ones who are literally putting up barbed wire fences.
Yeah.
So you can't be accused of Russia casting a Iron curtain that you are the ones putting the fences up this time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem to be that they're trying to antagonize.
Yeah, I mean, also, it's just not the diplomatic immunity and all that kind of stuff. They definitely could have made an exception. There's no reason why they needed to make this scene, and it doesn't make them look. It doesn't look good for them either. It doesn't look good for the EU. It doesn't look good for anyone. You're stopping, a presidential peace delegation from another country, from a number of countries. I mean, this wasn't just about the South Africans. I mean, there was it was Uganda, Egypt, South Africa, Comores, and I think it was one of the Congos, Brazzaville, Congo. What's interesting, a small little note there is Al-Sisi was supposed to come, but he pulled out and sent his prime minister. So they still sent a pretty important individual, but he himself didn't go, which was quite disappointment from Ramaphosa, the South African leader. Was obviously, I think he's kind of the main person who's been pushing this. But yeah, they would have liked to see.
Sisi might be a little bit sort because in the cables that came out that were leaked showed that Egypt was planning on buying weapons selling
sending rockets to the Russians.
Yeah. Then it seems that they backed out what looks like out of embarrassment.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think Sisi's in trouble with the West right now, and they are their main backers. So,
and this is a lot of it with these sort of third way tin pot dictators that sprang up and continue to spring up with Western sort of backing and approval, that they don't stay Western orientated for very long. The West install them thinking, you're going to be our sort of anchor to stop anything sort of progressive happening in that country again. Then they get their own ambitions pretty quickly afterwards, like the general in charge of the majority of Libya, who was an anti-Gaddafi fanatic and has since sort of gone his own way in America, trying to reel him back in again. So it does happen a lot. His name is completely gone. No,
definitely. I mean,
they get their own ambitions.
Sure. Well, I mean, Saddam Hussein kind of, was a friend of the West for a while, which turned out,
and more recently, both of these generals in Sudan, as we've seen.
Yeah. And I mean, also then you could also extend this to Saudi Arabia. The MBS and all those guys. They're completely armed by the West.
It was interesting. After we did our video on Sudan, when we posted that online, we saw a few people commented on it saying, it's just a Western coup. So it's not, though. It's like this time it isn't. Like things aren't as easy as just saying.
Right. The only other thing that I wanted to add on this whole thing about the African leaders was the agreement that Putin pulled out at the table, which I don't think the African guys were expecting, because no one's actually, I mean, he's never presented this. There was actually a bit of a chess piece, if you will, because in the discussion, so Putin accepted their peace plan and said, we'll consider it, and of course didn't poo-poo it, so to speak, didn't throw it away, but he did say, well, the issue is that we have tried to have peace deals with these people, and he pulled out what was the draft of a peace treaty, or at least a cessation of hostilities agreement draft from March last year, March 2022.
These are the high-profile talks that were going on at the time.
That's it, and they were, being, midwifed by Turkey. So I'm curious to see what Turkey says in the next couple of days, because this is very, very fresh. This has just come out a few, very recently. So if it's not true, if Putin is just making it up, Erdogan could undermine it. I don't know. It didn't happen. But anyway, Putin pulls the thing out, and basically what it says, I have to summarize here because I haven't, the actual document hasn't been shared yet, but it was a draft of, these are the security guarantees that the Russians want. These are the security guarantees that the Ukrainians want. It mentions troop numbers, tanks, what kinds of forces the Ukrainians will be allowed. So they have to scale back. They won't be allowed to join NATO, but there will be other security guarantees from other partners, but not a NATO-styled, full commitment. So that was apparently being discussed and on the table in March. And this is where, maybe a lot of the analysts now are saying, well, this is when that 40-kilometer long convoy of tanks was sitting outside of Kiev.
Yeah.
And Putin is saying that the reason they pulled out of Chernihiv and Kiev and never actually had the battles of those cities is because they were already showing their side of the bargain, saying like, okay, we are willing to take this document, this draft of yours. We've pulled our troops back.
They were literally at the city gates, weren't they? They was fighting in the outskirts of Kiev.
Vehicles had entered the city. Yeah, they were fighting in the city already. Yeah, but that column had stopped. And a lot of the analysts were like, "Oh, the Russians ran out of petrol and stuff like this." I think it's ridiculous. It's just a road, and there's gas stations around there. I think it's insane that they ran out of petrol. I'm sure there would be some stories where they did, but on balance, it doesn't seem like a legitimate explanation. Nonetheless, they, according to Putin, did pull back from Kiev and Chernihiv because of this discussion. But it was none other than Boris Johnson who flew in and said, no, don't follow this. You need to continue fighting. We are not going to give up on NATO. NATO is not off the table. We will not let you take NATO off the table, which speaks a lot about sovereignty and the Ukrainians being allowed to make their own decisions. But any thoughts on that? Because I've got some other thoughts on this, which I'll add. But what do you think?
I do quite believe that story. That I think if it wasn't true, somebody would have contradicted it. The fact that even Zelensky hasn't turned out and said that this is bullshit.
Yeah.
And it makes sense just looking at it because the columns were there and they did turn around.
Well, it was never quite clear why they didn't go in.
There was two rounds of quite high profile talks in a short period of time. I think it was over like a month, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of Western narrative was, nothing came of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, this column did turn around, so it looks like that those two things are related.
I think your point that if anyone can prove that this is bullshit and undermine Putin on a very important matter, which basically would undermine Putin's relationship with all of these African leaders and the African Union, because it would say Putin showed you a lie to try and undermine your plan, basically lied to your face.
Yeah.
So that's not very good on that front. But also it would just be Putin's a liar because this reason and this reason and this reason. So there's probably all sorts of, pro-Ukrainian, pro-NATO sources and journalists and diplomats and all sorts piecing and trying to find whatever they need or can find to prove this, if it is true, if it is true that it is a lie, to prove that it's a lie. So we'll wait. I mean, I'm sure the New York Times will publish that if they have the silver bullet and the proof that he's lying.
And if they don't, they'll just never mention it.
They haven't yet. No, they haven't yet, which tells me that it's either true, and that document is valid, or that it's just extremely difficult to disprove. I don't know. We'll see. But I do have a little sort of thing. I know that it's not necessarily the most. We like to think that everything is always about geopolitics and strategy, and everything is thought out, and everything is got a brilliant plan behind it. But there's a part of me that thinks that Boris Johnson also just dug his heels and said, "You've got to fight," because if you remember, he had just started his this whole controversy, which has now seen him out of Parliament. Never mind being Prime Minister. About these parties, about the COVID lockdown parties. So that story was just breaking in that sort of February as the war, as the invasion broke out. And knowing Boris Johnson as a character who wanted to save his prime ministership, which he'd seen, he wanted to have as a child, and comparing himself to Churchill all the time. The way he speaks to him.
That is the character he wanted. He wanted his Churchill moment.
And if you couple that with the panic that he needed his Falklands War to recover his prime ministership, it does fit quite nicely with that. But I do think there were bigger strategic implies. I don't think that Boris Johnson's drinking parties and him trying to save it is what led to the Americans forcing them, at the even further back behind to not.
But knowing how sort of weak politics is and politicians are, and how slimy and self-centered people can be, the idea, even the notion that some people might think is unrealistic, of a politician making a situation worse just for the sake of his own biopic. I can completely see that. The fact that if Boris was offered a peace treaty at the beginning of the war, the fact that I believe he would have turned it down because no, this is my Battle of Britain moment. This is where I get to be put on mugs for, and people remember me for. And wasn't Boris good in the war against Russia? Yeah,
it's his legacy. Yeah. I mean, and now he's not even in Parliament. He's been kicked. No. He kicked himself out of Parliament before they did.
Daily Mail. He's a columnist again.
Is he in the Daily Mail?
Yeah, he's back doing a column for the Daily Mail. So that's now another big scandal because that's breaking another parliamentary regulation that he only let them know half an hour before the news broke. Yeah, he's writing for the Daily Mail again.
Daily Mail. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I just like the fact that he quit before they would kick him out. So quitting your job before you're fired, basically.
Yeah, never looks the most innocent, does it?
Yeah. Anyway, but so the only other point then on this whole thing with the peace treaty and stuff is that we haven't actually mentioned this, but Angela Merkel on 2 occasions, so in an interview with a German publication and on a prank call with some Russians that managed to get in on that. I don't know who these Russian pranksters are. They're really good.
They've done it a few times, haven't they?
They've had Ben Wallace tell them the numbers of javelins in reserve. Russian prank calls apparently, one of their finest pieces of a weapon.
Yeah, they were the ones who got Nigel Farage to say "up the Ra."
No, probably.
So they didn't know what "up the Ra" meant.
Yeah. But anyway, Angela Merkel, what she said was that the Minsk agreements, the previous agreement from the 2014 outbreak of this same war, basically, that wasn't actually intended to resolve the conflict. It was intended to buy time for the Ukrainians to arm themselves and build up. Which I mean, Putin was upset with this, to say the least. But it's a really disturbing statement in the context of any diplomacy going forward. I mean, that's the German chancellor, arguably their best one, as a unified republic, unified country, and along with Macron, basically saying, "Oh yeah, well we make agreements that we don't plan to honor." I mean, how do you then build your diplomacy in going forward? It's a scary precedent to set.
Yeah, and I've always sort of said this. I've even sort of made enemies on the sort of communist left about the idea, the whole notion of sort of peace treaty, even going into like the Irish peace treaty. Like, they always seem as a stalling tactic. If you've not got what you fought for, then a peace treaty can only be that, can't it? And the Irish sort of peace process, in my eye, has done exactly the same thing. Of the Republicans haven't really gained very much since the peace process. All they've gained is promises. Everything, even now that they get excited about, like, everything is just words. No land has actually moved ownership. The British are still there. The separation barriers between communities are still there. And now you've got checks in the sea.
Yeah. It's you can almost say that with that example and with Merkel's is that peace agreements are not necessarily the end of something, that there might be worth something more engaging with whichever side takes that on. Any other things to add? I've kind of said all I wanted to say about this.
Not on that, I've got another point that I want to sort of transition to, and sort of on the same sort of theme of how one thing is viewed one way and someone else is viewed completely differently. In the Western activist circles, even amongst the sort of authoritarian sort of left, as we're referred to sometimes, which always confuses me, there's a love for Julian Assange, which I get that is a good stick to hit the Western governments over the head with for the way they've mistreated him. It always confuses me, like don't act like China wouldn't do the same thing. I mean, I can only imagine what a Chinese Julian Assange But there's a journalist who I follow in. He was in Ukraine for quite a long time, reporting on since the maiden there. Eventually, he got bagged and tagged by Ukrainian secret services, put a bag over his head, arrested, kicked out of the country. He's since managed to find his way back with the help of Russian armed forces, and he's now a frontline journalist in Donetsk. So a lot of the images, videos that I see, he'll be straight on the battlefield, gets his hands dirty. There's a journalist called Graham William Phillips. So I'm just going to get his page up here. So here's his Facebook in case anyone wants to follow him. He's on Telegram, he's on Twitter, he's on YouTube. What's significant is that he's British, as you can tell from the flag. Is a British citizen. He is not a Russian citizen. He is a journalist. He is not part of the Russian military. He is not part of any Russian political party. He's from London. He's a British journalist, independent journalist. He is the first and only British citizen to be targeted by Western sanctions. And what does this mean? It means that they've targeted his bank, they've targeted his property. He is now living in, at the moment, Donetsk, essentially off the charity of others. So, British pro-Kremlin vlogger added to UK government sanctions list. So they've gone after his assets, everything, the same that they would with any Russian oligarch, as they are now called.
Yeah.
Well, just oligarchs in general. Aren't the Ukrainian businessmen aren't called oligarchs anymore. They've had that title removed. They're now just Ukrainian businessmen.
They're just businessmen.
Has been accused of a conduit for pro-Russian propaganda. Is now one of 42 new designations added to the UK's Russia sanctions list. Now, this should be terrifying because what Graham's done, he's just reported from a battlefield. He hasn't leaked UK's secret documents like Assange did. He's done nothing that, on the face of it, or as far as anyone can explain to me, is illegal.
Yeah.
And what he's done, I don't see as any different to what we do on this channel, to what other people do in the States, what Caleb Maupin does. At what point can anyone be targeted? This seems like testing the waters for something much. Surely this is targeting dissent, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, unless the court papers can show evidence where he's paid by the Kremlin and they tell him what to say, and he's effectively then an agent, this is just an independent journalist who is just saying stuff they don't like, which that's not freedom of press. So, it's very much the same as Julian Assange.
And this should worry people to compare those two much more, because where Julian Assange, he did something that we can't do. We don't have WikiLeaks. We're not getting cables sent to us by disgruntled American soldiers. He's just showing and voicing an opinion. Half the time, he's not even voicing an opinion. He's literally just pointing a camera and shooting what's in front of him.
I've watched this stuff too. He has a car with a crew, a translator, one person. They drive. They were in. I mean, I watched them when they were in Mariupol.
Yeah, straight away. That they were some of the first people.
Yeah,
footage I saw in Mariupol was of him.
Yeah. No, I mean, and like you said, it's not like they would go, point the camera, talk about where they are, talk about what they've seen, and then ask to interview if they can. If the Russians choose to give them interviews, that's not the same as being pro-Kremlin or whatever. I mean, that's like saying if the BBC interviews Peskov or any Russian official and then allows them to speak and give an opinion, are they now pro-Kremlin? Are they now giving the Kremlin a platform? I mean, no. I mean, it's journalism. You have to have the space where, even if the government doesn't like that opponent, that side, you have to hear it. That's journalism, and also freedom of press is freedom of press is you get to choose what you publish. That's the freedom part. You don't get to choose. That no one else gets to pick. That's the whole essence of it. But to be honest, we already know that. So you mentioned the sort of what a Chinese Julian Assange would look like. But the point is that the Chinese don't portray themselves as heavily as defending or having this kind of freedom of press. They have their own security concerns, whatever, and that's why they say that they don't want to have a society like that because they're worried about the effects of it, whatever. Okay, but the UK and the US pretend and advocate and invade countries on those principles, which they then say they have, which, as we know with Julian Assange, as we know with this guy here, don't actually.
It's a shame that more of people who have more similar politics to us in the West don't promote Graham the same way, and as I'm saying, sort of contradictorily, do support Julian Assange as if we put up with him.
Yeah. I mean, in all fairness, I think if Graham gets arrested by the UK for journalism, then I think he'll become more famous. We'll see. I mean, it would be interesting to see if there was that hypocrisy, but I don't see one. But as we know with Julian Assange,
he's contact with the UK police, and the police have confirmed to him, which has made his point even stronger, that there's no charges pending for him in the UK. So it's like, so what have I been sanctioned for? Like that you've outlined that I'm a Russian propagandist and that my property's being seized, my finances being seized, but I can essentially return to the UK without being cuffed. Is that what you're telling me? Because that's what it sounds like at the moment.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I'm curious to see what is that. Maybe he just hasn't been charged yet, but surely he has to. I mean, I don't know how sanctions work on individuals, British citizens. I mean, do you have to be charged as an enemy of the state or something like that before? I don't know.
I'm not entirely sure how this has worked, because even with these Russian oligarchs who have been targeted, they're not also being charged with crimes, are they? Like with frozen assets of people, these Russian billionaires. But I assume that they could still be in this country without being arrested. I've not heard of a load of Russian businessmen being arrested in London or Harrods or what have you. And I'm sure there's still loads of them in the city of London.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I guess I would have to have some. I'd have to look into that, see how exactly what is the actual category of that. There's obviously some legal detail there that we're missing.
So there's got to be some sort of. It's a political charge rather than a criminal charge, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this does remind me of the time there was a British citizen in ISIS, and because Britain was taking part in the war against ISIS. They, conducted an airstrike on this person, but then there was, even though obviously no one, really cared about ISIS, but there was a legal question as to whether this had categorized as an execution of, by the state of its own citizens without trial, because they knew he was British. They blew him up, but at this point it was now an extrajudicial killing, basically, an execution. But we're not really quite that sort of area yet. We'll see what happens.
So the only other real thing that I've sort of got, which I thought was newsworthy, is this, which again, a bit of news that the West makes sound worse than what it is, and it contradicts something that happened at the same time. So Russian nukes have now landed in Belarus. The Belarusian government have asked to host Russian weapons, and Putin has agreed. And this is the first sort of step of Russia sort of bolstering its frontier, effectively. Sorry. Now, at the same time as this happening, there was another article of North Korea protesting against the American nuclear submarines now docking into South Korean ports. I thought, these two situations are exactly the same, aren't they, really? But one is an outrage in the West where one is not. For some reason, the West's complaint of Russian nukes getting closer to us, that's a complaint that's just. But North Korea's complaint about American nukes approaching them is unjust as always.
As always. Yeah. No, I mean, again, hypocrisy, right? I think on this one, if you're thinking about negotiations, this is quite clever from the Russian side. I mean, obviously it has its strategic and military effect, but this is something that they can also then bring as a piece to the negotiating table in a year or whenever, hopefully sooner. where they can say, okay, well, we will pull the missiles and weapons and the nuclear infrastructure that's in Belarus back. So it gives them pieces to move on the table.
Yeah. If it is for that strategy, then that does make sense too, because obviously the West have got a lot of their toys in the front that Russia would want pulling back in exchange.
Right.
Obviously, basically the entire of the American arsenal seems to have been deployed in Eastern Europe as of the last sort of 12 months. This is the biggest buildup of military might since World War II in Europe.
Speaking of that, as maybe a last question from myself, pause for thought. How do you think the offensive's going? How do you think it's going?
It seems to have, dud missed a little bit, doesn't it? Like the fact that it started with a dam blowing up, and it was like, oh well, I guess get those dinghies inflated because we're not getting our tanks through this.
Right.
Yeah, but it seems to have not done much. I think on our 6-month review of the war, where the border looked essentially what it did now, we theorized there that this is basically the forever line. I think now that's sort of solidifying that. The fact that they're saying, like, oh, causing a victory that we've taken these little rundown villages that are basically a pile of rocks with a flag on top of it. It's like, I don't think that counts, to be honest.
So I think the interesting bit is the debate as to when it starts, and then you can discuss the details on the ground, Leopard tanks being destroyed and Bradleys being destroyed and casualty numbers and videos of Ukrainian prisoners and this kind of stuff. That's one side to it. But the part that tells me that things are not going at least very well, perhaps badly, is the fact that some Ukrainian officials were dithering. They were like, "Oh no, this is not the offensive." So this is the thing that the offensive has actually been on for 2 weeks. It's been 2 weeks already.
It's like that sort of joke in like sitcoms where you have a birthday surprise and then they look at you and like, "Was that the surprise?" Like, no, that wasn't the surprise. The surprise is later. Basically, this one was a bit crap. We'll think of something else.
Right. So this has been the consistent thing. Yeah. So
it's
initially, all of the attacks just over 2 weeks ago, they were like, "Oh no, these are just probing attacks. This is not the offensive." And then when we had the first footage of Leopards blown up and Bradley's blown up, like, okay, no, it's the offensive. But there's other ones too. We've got more. Sort of. So
I think that's been quite sobering for the West, because obviously they've been saying, "Oh, look how much Russian armor they've lost and how good our armor is." It's like, yeah, but now you've got to a stage where your £100,000 tank can be taken out by a Russian kite with a bomb on it. That's pretty cheap for them to knock up. And all you need to do, if anyone is a fellow Redditor, is go onto the Our Ukraine Reddit, and you'll see loads of just aerial footage, shots of Russian drones blowing up Ukrainian tanks. And even just going by what we saw with those documents, where we saw solid numbers of how many of those tanks were, I counted at least 30 just in the videos that have been blown up. And that's just a visual count. If somebody is determined to, they could probably get more accurate figures by tallying these videos up than they could what the official losses of these tanks now are. But it's got to have made a dent in what they had.
No, and the other side is also that, as you mentioned, three, maybe I think it's up to 7 villages now. I saw a picture of one of them, and even Western media was like, "It's a village, but there are actually 6 buildings in this place, and no one lives here." And having but I mean, this is the classic thing, right? It was when Russia captures it, it's just a village. It's a pig pen for the sheep. It's a barn. When the Ukrainians capture it, it's a city. It's a metropolis.
And whatever Russia capture, the BBC will write after it, and offers no strategic value. Like you're telling that yourself.
And the other thing we haven't really covered yet was the Bakhmut thing. So Bakhmut, the Russians took the city weeks ago now. It's probably 5-6 weeks ago now. But there were Ukrainian movements in the fields to the north and south of them. So on the narrative side, British press could say they're still fighting near, in, around Bakhmut. And yeah, just wordplay. It's actually, I think there's a lot of good exercise taking place at the BBC with essay writing. Creative writing is there's a lot of great creative writing going out right.
One of the great ones I saw was big scary headline written in the BBC saying Wagner are withdrawing from Bakhmut, as if it was a fallout. And then when you read it, it's like they are withdrawing and handing control over to the Russian army. Because that's not what that headline meant. You were trying to like say that it was a big fallout, and they were saying, "Oh, we're not doing it for you anymore." But really, it's Wagner being used as a offensive force. When the offensive in that area is finished, they hand it over to the Russian military, who are being used as defensive. That seems to be the tactic that's working at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, this also comes back to the starting point: is that this is how the propaganda is working. This is how it works, by just deceiving, either blatantly by imagery or by just wordplay. Russia, Wagner's retreating because they've finished. They've stopped fighting. They've won the fight.
Retreat. It's done. I'm going home.
Going back. They're going home. But actually, they'll be back apparently July, I believe. We'll see.
Yeah. And also, I can't find it right now, but I read in one of them, I think it was like Moscow Times, or not the real Moscow Times, not the weird Western one, that there's been a bill passed to basically they want to try and incorporate Wagner into the Russian army.
I imagine they have to,
which is a great idea. We warned against this exact same thing in the Sudan episode, where we said it's always a bad idea to have two armies in one country.
Yes.
It can't go on.
Yeah.
Even when you watch Russian press, the amount of praise for victories that gets put onto Wagner, it's ego inflating, and it's easy to see where that's dangerous down the road of how do you reel these people back in.
Right. I think, and Prigozhin's already had these quite public outbursts and swearing at Shoigu and stuff that you shouldn't.
It's shouty rants.
That's not a good foundation.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And if you were, regardless of what is actually going on with the dispute between ammunition, if you're any defense minister in Russia, you're going to think, well, we're not putting up with this. This guy's basically threatening coups on TV.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is not a good idea. Yeah.
I hope that they do sort of incorporate it, but it's always a friction sort of filled enterprise, isn't it? Doing that, it never goes smoothly.
Well, I just hope that doesn't lead to something terrible.
No,
a split or an internal conflict. That would be a disaster. For everyone. Nuclear armed Russia, the superpower, having a civil war, not a good idea. So anything else, Chris?
I think we've done pretty well, to be honest.
Yes, we covered everything. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Chris, and we will see you probably most likely next week or in the week. If you have anything for us that you want us to cover or go into and talk about. Nixon will be coming back soon. This Friday he'll be back. He's been taking short leave, and perhaps some other characters. We've been hiring, and so the ministry staff is expanding. But thank you very much, and please like, share, and subscribe. Bye bye.
See you next week.